Marquette Iron Range, Michigan. September 1901. The autumn air was sharp with the scent of pine and the coming frost, but the talk of the settlement was not of the harvest or the closing of the shipping lanes on Superior. It was of the peculiar construction taking place on the parcel claimed by the Slovene, Jernej Kovač. He was not building a cabin. Not yet. First, he was building a wall. It stood apart from the cleared foundation, a freestanding spine of granite boulders rising 10 feet high. It was unconnected to anything, a line of stone drawn against the vast northern wilderness. Alonzo Grimshaw, the Marquette County land assessor, stopped his buggy on the rutted track to watch. He was a man who understood structures, who could price a cord of wood or a stand of timber by sight. He saw no sense in this. "What in God's name is that for, Kovich?" Grimshaw called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of his office. "A fence for giants?" Jernej Kovač, a man built as solidly as the stones he was lifting, placed a 200-pound granite boulder into the matrix. He nudged it, rocked it, settled it into its final resting place without a speck of mortar. He looked over at the assessor, his face impassive. "For the wind," he said, his English thick but clear. A few loggers, taking a break from a nearby stand of white pine, guffawed. "The wind ain't gonna climb over a fence, Slovene," one of them, a man named Silas Croft, yelled. "You're building a rock pile is all. A damned foolish waste of a strong back." Jernej turned back to his work, his silence a more profound answer than any argument. The wall grew day by day, a 4-foot thick, 24-foot-long behemoth of dry-stacked stone. It even had strange curved returns at either end, like the horns of a great beast. The community gave it a name, Kovich's Folly. They called him the Mad Mason of Marquette, the man building a wall to nowhere. What did this Slovenian dry stone mason, a man from the sun-beaten, wind-scoured karst plateau, understand about thermal mass and the physics of a wind shadow that the experienced, practical timbermen of the Upper Peninsula had missed? The answer would come with the winter, written not in words, but in degrees of temperature, in cords of wood saved, and in the stark difference between survival and suffering. I promise you, by the end of this story, you will understand the profound science behind Kovich's strange stone wall, a principle that modern architects still use today. We explore stories of forgotten genius here, so if you value ingenuity and the triumph of quiet knowledge over loud skepticism, consider subscribing to this channel, and let us know in the comments. What's the most unconventional but effective solution you've ever seen for a common problem? Jernej Kovač was not a frontiersman. He was not a logger, a miner, or a farmer. He was a man whose hands understood the language of stone. He was born and raised in a world of limestone, shallow soil, and a fierce, katabatic wind the locals called the berja. In the Kras region of his native Slovenia, you didn't fight the berja, you learned its habits. You built low, heavy-roofed houses, and you protected your precious gardens and livestock with massive, carefully constructed dry stone walls called gomile. These weren't fences, they were wind berms, structures designed to tame the air and hold the sun. His hands knew the heft of a keystone, the friction lock of a well-placed shim, the slow, patient transfer of heat through a cubic foot of rock. When he arrived in the Marquette Iron Range with his wife, Anja, and their 2 small children, Luca and Zofia, he brought none of the skills his new neighbors valued. He could not fell a 30-inch pine with clean, efficient cuts, nor could he read the mineral signs in an outcropping. He knew stone, wind, and sun. Their first winter in a hastily built, standard-issue log cabin was a lesson in a different kind of wind. The relentless north wind off Lake Superior was not like the gusting Berja. It was a steady, soul-sapping presence that pressed against the north wall of their home for months. It was a physical force that seemed to suck the life and warmth right through the chinked logs. That winter of 1900 was a litany of small, brutal failures. One morning, the cast-iron handle of their water pump, made brittle by the deep cold, snapped clean off in Jernej's hand on the first pull. Anja tried to update the family ledger, a meticulous habit from the old country, but the ink froze solid in the well before the first church bell rang. The worst was the day Jernej went to the shed for his heavy wool coat, hung on a peg. When he lifted it, the fabric, frozen stiff as a plank, cracked audibly at the shoulder, leaving a tear that could not be mended. They survived, but only just. They burned through a mountain of wood, yet the cold was a constant occupant in their home. The children slept in their coats, their faces pinched and pale. Jernej watched the hoarfrost creep across the inside of the north-facing wall, a crystalline map of their misery. He vowed that his family would never endure another winter like it. He was not a logger, but he could build. And he would build what he knew. The problem tormenting the settlers of the Marquette range wasn't just the cold. It was the specific way the cold attacked their homes. The standard cabin was a fortress of wood, a testament to the immense labor of felling and hewing timber. But it was a fortress with a fatal flaw. Built from single-withe logs, its primary defense was the thickness of the wood and the integrity of the chinking, the mix of mud, moss, and clay packed between the logs. Under the assault of a Michigan winter, this defense crumbled. The constant freezing and thawing, the settling of the green logs, and the sheer pressure of the wind created hairline cracks in the chinking. The north wind, unimpeded across the frozen expanse of Lake Superior, would find these cracks. It was a process called wind scour, or forced convection. The wind didn't just make it feel colder, it actively stripped heat away. Every cubic foot of 60-degree air that was sucked out through a crack on the leeward side of the cabin was replaced by a cubic foot of like air at 20-degree air forced in on the windward side. A family like the O'Malleys, 2 parcels down from Kovich, could have a roaring fire in their stove, a fire consuming seasoned oak at an alarming rate, yet their children would still shiver in their beds. The stove was fighting a losing battle against the entire Arctic. It was trying to heat a box that was constantly being flushed with polar air. The heat produced was immense, but it was transient. As soon as it radiated from the stove, it was stolen by the drafts and conducted through the solid logs. The back of your body would be roasting while your front was freezing. A common complaint that spoke to a deep thermal imbalance. The Dubois family, French-Canadian loggers with 3 generations of winter experience, faced the same physics. Bartholomew Dubois, the patriarch, was a master of chinking. He used a proprietary mix involving horsehair and lime that was the envy of the settlement. But even his best work was no match for the relentless wind. He would spend hours each week reapplying his mixture, fighting a battle of attrition against the cold. Inside his cabin, the north wall was always degrees colder to the touch than the others. Any stored food near it would freeze solid. A bucket of water left near that wall overnight would have a thick cap of ice by morning, despite the stove glowing red just 10 feet away. The problem wasn't the quality of their cabins. The problem was the design. They were fighting a war of insulation when they should have been fighting a war of airflow. In the late summer of 1900, as his neighbors were laying in their winter wood supplies, Jernej Kovač began his own preparations. He started not with an axe, but with a sledgehammer and a stone boat. He got permission to haul away granite tailings from the new iron ore pit, boulders of all sizes, considered waste by the mining company. To Jernej, they were building blocks of the highest quality. He laid out the footprint first, a straight line, 24 feet long, running east to west, positioned precisely 4 feet north of where his cabin's back wall would be. He dug a shallow trench to bedrock, ensuring his foundation was absolute. Then, the slow, patient work began. He wasn't just piling rocks, he was weaving them together. This was the art of dry stone masonry. Each boulder was selected for its shape, its weight, its fit. He used no mortar, only gravity, friction, and an intuitive understanding of physics that had been passed down through generations. He built the wall with a slight batter, leaning inward from bottom to top, giving it immense stability. He used smaller stones to fill the interstitial spaces, locking the larger boulders together into a monolithic mass. The wall rose, a mosaic of gray and pink granite, 10 feet into the air. At the ends, he curved the wall back southward for about 6 feet, creating 2 wings that would catch any flanking wind. Alonzo Grimshaw made his official visit in October, clipboard in hand. He walked the perimeter of the wall, his boots crunching on the stone chips. He tapped it with his knuckles. It was as solid as the Canadian shield it stood on. "Kovač," he began, his tone official, "I've been reviewing the county ordinances regarding property improvements. This structure is not a fence, as it encloses nothing. It is not a foundation, as nothing rests upon it. It is, by definition, a freestanding wall of significant height." Jernej paused, a 50-pound stone held effortlessly in one hand. "It is a wind berm." Grimshaw ignored the foreign term. Under county code, a structure of this nature, unconnected to a primary dwelling, is not classified as a beneficial improvement. In fact, due to its height and proximity to your future dwelling, it could be considered a hazard improvement. He made a note on his clipboard. "I'll have to report this to the land office. It could affect the classification of your parcel, might even jeopardize your filing if it's deemed a liability." The threat was clear. It was an economic attack, couched in the language of bureaucracy. This wasn't just mockery, it was an official declaration that his work was not only foolish, but potentially illegal, a danger that could cost him his land. Any other man might have argued, protested, pleaded. Jernej simply looked at the wall, a structure he knew was the key to his family's safety. He looked at Grimshaw, a man who saw only liability. He nodded once. "I understand," he said. Then he turned and placed the stone he was holding, fitting it perfectly into the wall. He returned to his work. Behind the finished wall, he built his home. It was a simple, steep-roofed A-frame made of logs, a design that shed snow with ease. But its genius was its relationship to the stone sentinel that guarded it. The north gable of the A-frame, the one that would face the full fury of the winter, was just 4 feet from the towering, warm-blooded stone. The brilliance of Jernej Kovač's wall rested on 2 fundamental principles of physics, working in perfect concert. The first was simple, the creation of a wind shadow. The second was more profound, the wall as a thermal battery. Let's first consider the wind shadow. The misery of a northern winter is often misunderstood as temperature alone, but the true enemy is wind chill. An ambient temperature of 34 degrees is dangerous but manageable. When a 25-mile-per-hour wind is added, the effect on exposed surfaces, whether it's human skin or the wooden logs of a cabin, is equivalent to a temperature of 52 degrees. This isn't a psychological trick. It's a physical reality. The moving air strips away the thin layer of warmth at the surface of an object, a process called convective heat loss. It accelerates the rate at which an object freezes, dramatically. Kovich's 10-foot-high, 24-foot-long wall acted as a physical barrier. It simply stopped the wind. In the 4-foot gap between the stone wall and the wooden gable of his A-frame, the air was almost perfectly still. The wind that howled over the top and around the curved ends of the wall could not penetrate this sanctuary of calm. Inside that protected space, the effective temperature on the surface of his cabin's north wall was no longer 52 degrees. It was 34 degrees. By defeating the wind, Jernej had already given his home a thermal advantage of nearly 20 degrees. He had eliminated the single greatest factor in heat loss before it ever touched his home. But this was only half of the equation. The true genius was the wall's second function, a massive thermal battery. Granite, the material of the wall, has a density of approximately 155 pounds per cubic foot. The wall's dimensions were 10 feet high, 4 feet thick, and 24 feet long. This gives it a volume of 960 cubic feet. The total weight of the structure was a staggering 148,800 pounds, or about 74 tons of solid rock. This immense mass was key. Every material has a property called specific heat, the amount of energy required to raise its temperature. Rock has a high thermal mass, meaning it can absorb and store a tremendous amount of heat energy. During the day, even on the coldest winter days, the sun travels in a low arc across the southern sky. The south-facing side of Kovich's wall, a broad target of nearly 240 square feet, would absorb this solar radiation for hours. This energy, measured in British thermal units, BTUs, would slowly begin to soak into the stone. A single linear foot of his wall, 4 feet thick, could store an estimated 15,000 BTUs of thermal energy. As the sun set, this stored heat would begin its slow migration through the 4 feet of granite. Hours later, in the dead of night, that same solar energy would emerge on the north face of the wall. It radiated outwards, not as a blast of heat, but as a gentle, persistent warmth. This radiant heat poured into the 4-foot pocket of still air between the wall and the cabin. It warmed the air, and it warmed the logs of the north gable itself. The outside surface of Jernej's home was not facing a 34-degree Arctic wind. It was facing a 74-ton granite radiator, gently raising the temperature in its protected microclimate. The wind chill had been reduced from 52 degrees to 18 degrees at the gable. He hadn't just built a shield, he had built a secondary sun that worked through the night. That January, the polar surge came. It was not a storm, but a quiet, lethal occupation of cold. For 12 consecutive nights, the temperature plunged to 34 degrees, driven by a relentless 25 mm wind that scoured the landscape clean. The ancient cedar boughs on the hillsides became coated in a thick, feathery layer of hoar frost, a sign of deep and penetrating cold. The sound of the wind was a constant low moan, a predator circling every dwelling. In the O'Malley cabin, the fight was desperate. They burned wood at a frantic pace. The stove was a hungry mouth they could never seem to fill. Their water barrel, kept just 2 feet from the glowing stove, froze solid. They huddled together under every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the air inside their own home. At the Dubois homestead, Bartholomew's famous chinking failed in a dozen places, and the wind whistled through the gaps, a mocking tune of defeat. The cold was winning. Inside the Kovich A-frame, another reality was unfolding. The wind was a distant roar, a sound heard but not felt. There were no drafts. The north wall of the cabin, the one that should have been leaching heat, was strangely neutral to the touch. It was not warm, but it was not cold either. It felt calm. Anja Kovač practiced the small miracles of normalcy that the cold forbade her neighbors. She kept her Slovenian sourdough starter, a precious link to her homeland, alive in a crock on a shelf against that northern wall. Anywhere else, it would have been a frozen, dead lump of flour. Here, it bubbled gently, alive. Luca and Zofia were not confined to the immediate orbit of the stove. They sat on the floor in the middle of the room, mending fishing nets with their father, their fingers nimble and warm. The ultimate proof, a detail of domestic science, sat on that same north-facing shelf. It was a crock of zganci, a traditional Slovenian dish of buckwheat mush. It was a hearty, dense meal that held its heat well. Anja had made a large pot of it for the evening meal. Hours after the stove had been banked for the night, long after the coals had cooled, Jernej went to the crock. He dipped a spoon in. The zganci was still warm. Not hot, but thick, soft, and life-givingly warm. In every other cabin across the Iron Range, a pot of mush left on a stovetop would have frozen solid before the last embers died. Here, shielded by 74 tons of sun-warmed granite, it was as if the laws of winter had been temporarily suspended. Alonzo Grimshaw cursed the cold, his breath a cloud of ice crystals that immediately froze to his muffler. His job as land assessor required him to make the tax circuit even in the deepest winter, and this polar surge was testing the limits of his endurance and his equipment. As his sled, pulled by a weary horse, approached the turnoff for the Kovich parcel, there was a sharp crack, like a rifle shot. The steel runner on the left side of his sled, made brittle as glass by the 34-degree air cold, had snapped. He was stranded. He unhitched the horse and began the slow, painful walk, leading the animal through the deepening snow. The wind was a physical blow, stealing his breath and burning his exposed skin. He was beginning to feel the deep, insidious lethargy of hypothermia setting in. Then he saw it through the swirling snow. Kovich's Folly, the stone wall. He had no love for the structure or its stubborn builder, but any break from this wind was a gift from God. He stumbled towards it, his legs heavy and uncooperative. He rounded the western horn of the wall and stepped into the 4-foot gap between it and the A-frame. The effect was instantaneous and shocking. The world went silent. The roaring, punishing wind vanished, replaced by an unnerving, profound stillness. The oppressive pressure on his body was gone. He leaned against the log wall of the cabin for a moment, catching his breath, his body shivering uncontrollably. He expected the stone wall opposite him to be a monument of cold, radiating a chill that would cut through his coat. Hesitantly, driven by a flicker of morbid curiosity, he reached out a gloved hand and touched the granite. He felt nothing through the thick leather. He pulled off his glove, his bare fingers clumsy and numb. He pressed his palm flat against the massive boulders. He did not feel the biting, moisture-sucking cold he expected. He felt nothing. No, that wasn't right. It was something more than nothing. It was a lack of cold. He pressed harder, leaning his weight against it. And then he felt it. A faint, deep, and utterly unbelievable warmth. It was a dry, gentle energy radiating from the very heart of the stone. It felt ancient, alive. At dusk, in the middle of a polar vortex, this rock was breathing heat. He stared at his hand on the stone, his mind struggling to reconcile the sensation with a lifetime of experience. Everything he knew about winter, about stone, about survival, was wrong. The mockery drained out of him, replaced by a wave of awe so powerful it made him dizzy. Jernej found him there minutes later, a silhouette of a man slumped against the wall, staring into space. He helped the dazed assessor inside, into the impossible warmth of his home. Grimshaw saw the children playing, saw the placid comfort of the room, and understood. He sat by the stove, sipping hot tea Anja had given him, the feeling slowly returning to his limbs. He looked at the quiet mason, who had endured the settlement's ridicule for months. "I called your wall a hazard," Grimshaw said, his voice raspy. "I was a fool." He looked towards the north wall of the cabin, seeing it now not as a barrier, but as a receiver. "You didn't build a wall to block the wind, Kovich." He paused, searching for the right words, a way to describe the impossible thing he had just felt. "You built a reservoir for the sun." The conversion of Alonzo Grimshaw was as total as it was sudden. The next day, after Jernej helped him mend his sled runner, the assessor returned to Marquette and formally withdrew his hazard improvement classification. In its place, he filed a special commendation, noting the structure's unique and highly effective adaptation to local climate extremes. Word of what Grimshaw had experienced at the Kovich homestead spread faster than any winter gossip. It was one thing for the strange Slovene to claim his wall worked. It was another for the county assessor, a man of ledgers and laws, to validate it with the authority of his own senses. Men who had laughed at the wall now stopped by. Their curiosity piqued. Jernej, when asked to explain, did not lecture on BTUs or specific heat. He spoke in the simple language of his craft. The sun gives its warmth to the stone all day, he would say, gesturing with his calloused hands. The stone holds it. At night, when the wind comes, the stone gives it back. It stands watch. The idea resonated most deeply within his own community. The local chapter of the Slovenska Narodna Podporna Jednota, the Slovene National Benefit Society, a fraternal organization that served as the cultural and social heart for immigrants, invited Jernej to speak. He didn't speak. He drew. On a large piece of butcher paper, he sketched a simple cross-section: the sun, the thick stone wall, the pocket of still air, the A-frame cabin. He drew arrows, showing the path of the wind over the top and the path of the heat radiating into the gap. That March of 1902, the SNPJ printed copies of his drawing. It was distributed to Slovenian families throughout the Iron Range, from Nagoni to Ishpeming, and as far west as Baraga. The diagram, simple and elegant, was a blueprint for survival. By the following autumn, 6 other Slovenian miner families, men who understood the deep, stable temperature of the earth from their work in the pits, had built their own variations. The Novak family in Baraga built one with a lower, thicker profile. The Zupancic family near Republic built their A-frame directly into the leeward side of a natural granite outcrop, applying the same principle. Kovich's Folly was becoming the Kovich method. The laughter had stopped. The validation was being built, stone by heavy stone, across the landscape. The quiet mason of Marquette had, without any formal training in thermodynamics, built a structure that anticipated the core principles of modern passive solar design by more than half a century. His dry stone wall was, in modern terms, a trombe wall, an externally placed thermal mass designed to absorb solar energy and radiate it into a living space. His understanding of the wind shadow effect is a fundamental component of modern architectural engineering and landscape design, where windbreaks are strategically planted and built to reduce heating costs and improve comfort. Jernej Kovač's innovation was a product of what is often called vernacular architecture, a way of building derived from local needs, local materials, and knowledge passed down through generations. He didn't have charts of R values or computer models of airflow. He had an inherited, embodied wisdom from the Karst Plateau. He knew the character of the wind and the soul of the stone. His work serves as a powerful reminder that the most advanced solutions are often elegant, simple, and rooted in a deep observation of the natural world. He solved a 20th century energy crisis with a technique that was thousands of years old. In the end, the story of Jernej Kovač and his wall is a story about a profound shift in perspective. His neighbors saw the north wind as an enemy to be fought, a force to be barricaded against. They built thicker walls, stuffed more chinking, and burned more wood in an endless battle of attrition. They saw the problem as a brute force conflict. Jernej saw it differently. He didn't build his cabin against the north wind. He didn't see the wind as an enemy to be vanquished. Instead, he asked a Boulder wall to stand watch. He built a partner, a silent granite guardian tasked with a simple, elegant job: to gather the free warmth of the winter sun and pour it back through the night. The wall wasn't a fortress, it was a vessel. It held the memory of daylight and released it into the darkness, creating a small pocket of grace in the heart of a brutal winter. It was an act not of defiance, but of quiet cooperation with the fundamental forces of his new home. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you believe that the best ideas often come from the quiet corners where old wisdom meets new challenges, please like this video and subscribe for more stories from the annals of forgotten history. We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. What other examples of brilliant, low-tech solutions to complex problems deserve to be remembered? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Any application of these or similar techniques in a modern context should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and professional regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.